What are the strategies to buy investment property using SMSF?
There's not like one strategy as such. There could be many strategies. It all depends on the individual circumstance, individual's capability, and also how much amount they have in the fund and all these other factors. Um, like in my particular case, like my super was like badly lost multiple occasions. For example, like during the global financial crisis, almost half of my amount was gone. In spite of being little bit, like you had a choice to select safer options. So in spite of having a balanced growth and having some part of it as safe, still we lost a lot. And what I've seen is similar thing can happen multiple times, like during, for example, there's a war, Ukraine war, or anything like that, can affect the overall performance of the super fund, the normal super fund. That's the reason I decided to take things into my own control, because I was more worried about like the super funds doing the sort of the best for me. And then I started doing it on my way, but I had to do a lot of research, attend many seminars, talk to many people who have done this. I personally found, particularly in Australia, like investing in real estate was one of the good options. I mean, I do still have shares within my portfolio, but like majority part of my super fund is invested in the real estate, and which has done very well so far. I've been investing for the last, I would say, 10, 11 years, and they have done very well both in terms of returns on investment and also in terms of capital growth. So strategy could differ depending on the situation, but in my case, it was more into having long-term assets, which are like um, um, real estate. As of now, I've not gone into commercial real estate, but more into residential real estate. Um, I personally felt it was like very stable, growing very well, good capital growth, and less of risks. So I just chose for residential real estate, and it's done very well so far. So that's my strategy. But in between, I'll have like disposable or income or amount was sitting in the account, which is not part of property. So which I can use it for shares and other sort of short to little bit of a medium term investments, which can also grow over a period of time. But once I have enough to buy a property, I have bought the property. So that is my strategy as such.
What should be the minimum amount you should have in SMS to buy a property?
Yeah, that's a figure which varies dramatically depending on who you talk to, um, but it all depends on few different factors. For example, the amount of the fees you pay for managing the SMSF is quite high. So um, that you have to make sure that if you have like a very small amount in self-managed super fund, you may not, or SMSF, you may not be able to sort of buy a property, and still you may be paying a hefty auditing and tax return fees. So that's one thing. Second thing is how much you can borrow can be a factor. For example, some time ago, banks used to pay 80% of the LVR was 80%, which is you could borrow 80% to buy a property. But now it's a little bit difficult to get 80%, so you're looking more like 60 to 70%. So whatever amount you have has to form like 30 to 40% of your asset. So if you have very less, like for example 50,000, 50,000 may be very small amount. If you consider you borrow another 60%, which means like another 60,000. So you're looking at 110,000, which is not enough to buy a property. So on the other hand, if you have like 200,000, so that forms your 30 or 40%, and that way you have enough money to buy a decent property. So uh, that's how like the amount is determined. So in general, they say around 200 to 220,000 is a good sort of amount to start investing. But again, as I mentioned, it depends on a few different factors: how much you can leverage, how much can the bank lend. Banks again have their own criteria. They might lend more for a capital city versus a regional city, or some banks might lend more than the other banks. So there are factors which affect that as well. So in short, you have to look at these factors and decide what is required. So as a thumb rule, maybe around 200 to 220,000 would be a good starting point. But again, as I mentioned, it's best to talk to a financial advisor to get the correct figures worked out. But in my experience, that sounds like a good figure.
So most of the immigrants who has come around like 5 or 10 years back, they might not have super of worth like 200,000 at this time. They might have some 80,000, 200,000. In that case, what kind of properties that they can buy in terms of price?
Yeah. So one thing I've noticed is people have money outside of super. They have less within the super. But what they forget is they can also contribute. Say, for example, there are 4 people within the SMSF. So each of them can also contribute after tax money. When I checked last time, it was about $150,000, but that could vary. You have to check the latest what is allowed. But each one of them can contribute. Say, for example, they all have 50,000 each outside of super. So they can all put 50,000 each. So that can make it 200,000 on top of whatever is within the super already. So that can boost up the amount and enable them to buy a property. So that's one thing. The other thing is there is also option of ETFs, exchange traded funds. So these companies can invest in real estate, and instead of buying one whole like a house or a property, you could be buying part of it. So that is another option. I haven't explored much into ETFs. I prefer to buy on my own like an individual property, but there are other options available. Also, if they want to set up and improve their financial status within the SMSF, they could still set up with a lesser amount and then put more in the following years and build up their equity. So there are a few different ways you can do it. One option is that maximum allowed amount, I think it's about $27,500 now per year. That's taxed at 15%. So some employers could be, depending on the salary, they could be paying $10,000